At the tender age of 6, Emily heard it for the first time. "You're so difficult." Her mom said it absent-mindedly while tidying up the kitchen, not even looking at her. All Emily had asked for was a little help with her sneakers. That was it. But the words hung in the air, as if Emily were a problem to be solved, not a child to be seen and understood. She didn't fully grasp it then, only felt a strange tightness in her chest, a feeling of being unseen. The next day it happened again. "You're such a difficult child." This time it was because Emily cried when the teacher raised her voice at school. Her mom sighed a weary sigh, as if her daughter's tears were some sort of personal, calculated inconvenience. On the third day, Emily innocently asked for a glass of water during dinner. "You're so difficult," her mom repeated, rising from the table with that look. That look that silently screamed, "Your mere existence drains my patience." Carl Jung, the renowned Swiss psychiatrist, discovered something that many psychologists often overlook. Narcissism isn't always born from a single, overtly violent trauma. Instead, it often takes root through repetition, through daily programming, through those same toxic phrases, seeping into a child's subconscious day after day until the child can no longer distinguish between their mother's voice and the voice inside their own head. There's one specific phrase that stands out, a leading cause of what we call parental narcissism. When mothers repeat this particular phrase day in and day out, something profound happens within the child's psyche, something Jung termed the installation of a negative mother complex. It's a mechanical process, precise, almost invisible to the outside observer, but utterly devastating for the one experiencing it from within. Over the next few minutes, you're going to understand how a seemingly simple phrase, when repeated daily, breaches every defense of a child's developing ego, how it morphs into a permanent part of their identity, how these words become the internal script, dictating decisions, relationships, and even self-sabotage for decades to come, and why most people who grew up hearing this phrase don't even realize they're replaying the program. The phrase itself is simple, deceptively so. But what it does to a child's psychological development without conscious intervention can be irreversibly damaging. Emily repeated those words for 30 years. "You're so difficult." Every time she dared to ask someone for something, every time she expressed a need, every time her body signaled tiredness, hunger, or pain, her mother's voice echoed automatically, "You're so difficult." And then Emily would simply shut down, contain herself, apologize for even existing. Jung wisely observed that a young child doesn't possess a strong enough ego to effectively filter parental projections, so they absorb everything, literally everything. When a mother constantly says, "You're so difficult," the child doesn't think, "Oh, this is just her frustration being projected onto me." No, the child internalizes it, thinking, "I am difficult. This is a fundamental truth about me. This is who I am." And here's the crucial point that most people miss about the formation of narcissism. It's not the isolated phrase that does the destruction. It's the unrelenting repetition that programs. It's the everyday occurrences that create the complex. Because the child's subconscious learns through repetition, not through logic. It doesn't analyze. It simply records. When Emily was around 8 years old, she stopped asking for help altogether, stopped asking for water, stopped asking for anything, because every need she expressed was inevitably met with that phrase, "You're so difficult." And each time she heard it, something inside her quietly died, not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a silent, withering way, like a plant slowly fading because no one remembers to water it. She learned to become invisible, to avoid causing any trouble, to suppress her needs. Jung would likely describe this as the beginning of the formation of a false self. The child effectively kills off the authentic part of themselves that has genuine needs, and constructs a persona, an easy child, a child who doesn't ask for anything, a child who doesn't feel anything, a child who exists only to not be a problem. But here's what silently festers in the shadows. That murdered part doesn't simply vanish. It buries itself deep down. And in adulthood, it resurfaces in ways that the person doesn't consciously connect to its original source. Emily, at 36, found herself unable to maintain lasting relationships. She ended things prematurely, before the other person could truly discover who she really was. Because deep down, Emily believed that if someone knew her truly, they would inevitably find her difficult, unbearable, a burden. She unconsciously chose emotionally unavailable partners. People who unwittingly confirmed her internalized belief. People who made her feel that asking for anything was, indeed, asking too much. And when these relationships inevitably crumbled, Emily secretly felt a sense of relief, because alone she didn't have to be difficult for anyone. Jung keenly explained that the negative mother complex operates much like a computer program running quietly in the background. Emily wasn't consciously deciding to sabotage her relationships. The complex was deciding for her, automatically. Every time she started to grow close to someone, that inner voice would erupt. "You're so difficult. Better to pull away before they find out." Is this narcissism? Many people mistakenly believe that narcissism is only about grandiosity. But Jung astutely revealed that there's another type. The narcissism of the empty self. The kind of person who believes that their very essence is fundamentally flawed. That any need they might have is somehow excessive, that they must strive to be perfect, silent and invisible in order to even be considered lovable. And this narcissism of emptiness, this void, is born precisely in this way. From repeatedly delivered phrases, "You're so difficult," "You're so sensitive," "You're so dramatic," "You're so needy." Each variation of that phrase accomplishes the same devastating thing. It tells the child, your emotional needs are a defect. Your sensitivity is a problem. Your very humanity is an inconvenience. Emily never had a dramatic breakdown. She never screamed at her mother, never outwardly rebelled. She simply faded away. And the more she faded, the more her mother praised her for being such a good daughter, for not being any trouble, for being so easy to raise. But on the inside, Emily was starving, emotionally starved, and she didn't even realize it. Because the hunger had been effectively murdered along with the need itself. At 40 years old, Emily finally sought out a Jungian therapist. Not because she consciously recognized the problem, but because she could no longer feel anything. She described it as emotional anesthesia, like living inside an aquarium, watching life unfold, but perpetually separated from it by an invisible glass wall. The therapist asked her a seemingly simple question. "When was the last time you asked for something you truly wanted?" Emily fell silent, not because she was thoughtfully considering the question, but because the question itself simply didn't make sense to her. Asking for what she wanted had never been an option, because wanting meant being difficult. And then the therapist reframed the question. "What did your mother say when you were a child and you asked for something?" The answer came automatically, without hesitation. "You're so difficult." Emily spoke the words without any apparent emotion, as if merely stating a cold, hard fact. And then For the first time in 34 years, she made the connection. The voice inside her head. It wasn't her own. It was her mother's, repeated so many times that it had become indistinguishable from her own thoughts. Jung eloquently termed this unconscious identification with the parental complex. The child doesn't just hear the phrase. She becomes the phrase. The maternal judgment transforms into self-judgment. The external rejection morphs into internal rejection. A cycle that can only be broken through conscious awareness. And what's worse is that it happens so gradually that the adult person swears they've always been this way, that they were born this way. But no one is born thinking their needs are a burden. That's taught every single day through words that seem small, but carry the weight of a verdict. Emily's mom never hit her, never physically abandoned her. To the outside world, she was a present mother. But emotionally, Emily was abandoned every single day. Every time she expressed a need and heard, "You're such a difficult child, and here's what makes this," cause number 2 of narcissism. Because it's subtle, because it's socially accepted, because everyone around thinks the mom is just tired. Just being realistic, just teaching her daughter not to be spoiled. No one sees that an emotional murder is happening in slow motion. Hold on, because the most important thing about how this complex is installed is coming up, and it will explain why simply knowing this isn't enough to free yourself. Carl Jung discovered that there are 3 layers in the installation of a negative mother complex through daily repetition. The first layer is the recording. The child hears the phrase. The second layer is the incorporation. The child believes the phrase, but the third layer is what imprisons them forever. The automatization. When the complex becomes automated, it no longer needs the mother's voice to function. It runs on its own perpetually, without the person realizing it. Emily could be 1,000 miles away from her mother, could go years without seeing her, but the complex kept operating. "You're so difficult," the voice would fire automatically every single time. Emily felt an emotional need rising. And here's the cruelest part. The more efficient the complex, the more invisible it becomes. Emily didn't think, "I'm hearing my mother's voice." She thought, "I'm being realistic about myself. I'm recognizing my flaws. I'm being conscious of my limits." The complex had disguised itself as self-awareness. Emily's Jungian therapist used a specific technique. She asked Emily to say the phrase out loud, "You're so difficult," but not as an affirmation about herself, as if she were talking to a child, a 6-year-old. Emily tried. The voice caught in her throat. She couldn't say it, looking at the image of a child, and then she understood. She would never accept speaking like that to a child, to any child. But to herself, she said it 50 times a day, and thought it was normal. Jung explained that the healing of the negative mother complex starts exactly here. The moment the person can see the cruelty of the words, as if they were being said to another person. Because while the words are said only internally, they seem like neutral truths. But when you externalize them, when you see them, the cruelty becomes impossible to deny. Emily started tracking. Every time the internal voice fired, "You're so difficult." She wrote it down. What was happening? What was she feeling? What did she need? On the first day, she noted it 17 times. She needed to rest. "You're so difficult." She wanted to decline an invitation. "You're so difficult." She felt anger towards someone. "You're so difficult." She got hungry outside of mealtimes. "You're so difficult." Every basic human need triggered the complex. On the second day, 19 times. On the third, 22. The more she paid attention, the more she realized that the complex was present in absolutely everything. It governed her entire life, and she didn't even know it. That's what Carl Jung meant when he said that the unconscious is more powerful than the conscious. Emily believed she was making decisions freely, that she was choosing her relationships, that she was deciding when to speak and when to remain silent. But it wasn't her deciding. It was the complex, running automatically, controlling everything, and her mother's phrase had been just the programming code, the command that installed the software. Now, the software ran on its own, independent of her mother, independent of whether Emily wanted it to or not. Emily's mother never understood. When Emily, already in therapy, tried to talk about it, her mother was offended. "I raised you the best way I could. You were really difficult sometimes. I was tired. I was alone." Every mother says these things. And technically, her mother was right. On one point, every mother does say these things. But Jung would show that the issue isn't saying it once. It's the repetition. It's the daily programming. It's turning a moment of frustration into a permanent verdict on the child's identity. Emily's mother wasn't a monster. She had also been programmed by her mother, who had been programmed by her mother. Carl Jung called this the generational transmission of the complex. The wound passes from mother to daughter, like an invisible inheritance. No one consciously decides to transmit it, but the complex replicates itself on its own. Emily discovered that her grandmother had used the same phrase with her mother, "You're so difficult," and her great-grandmother had used it with her grandmother. 3 generations of women teaching their daughters that their emotional needs were a character defect. And here's what turns this into narcissism, because when a child learns that their needs are defective, they develop one of 2 adaptations. Either they kill the needs and become empty inside, a false self that exists only to please, or they inflate the needs to grandiosity, demanding constant attention to compensate for the internal lack. Emily had chosen the first, the emptiness, the invisibility. But she knew people who had chosen the second, people who never stopped demanding attention, who monopolized conversations, who turned everything into drama. But underneath the grandiosity, the wound was the same. "You're so difficult. I am not enough, as I am." Jung said that narcissism is always a defense against an unbearable wound, and the most unbearable wound of all is the message that you, as you are a problem that needs to be fixed. Emily's journey in therapy took 4 years, not because the understanding was complex, but because uninstalling a complex that was installed by 20 years of daily repetition requires more than insight. It requires returning. She had to learn to feel needs without judgment. She had to practice asking for things without apologizing. She had to train the internal voice to say, "You have the right to need." Every time the complex fired, "You're so difficult." And in the beginning, it was agony, because the complex doesn't give up easily. Every time Emily asked for something, the complex screamed louder, "You're so difficult. You're being exaggerated. You're bothering people." But now, she knew that it wasn't her voice. It was her mother's voice, and before that, her grandmother's, and before that, her great-grandmother's. She was breaking a cycle of 100 years. Jung explained that individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, demands that you slay the parental complexes that live inside of you. Not kill your parents, of course, but kill the programming, Kill the internalized voice. Kill the verdict that was installed when you had no defenses to resist it. Emily had a turning point at 43. She was in a new relationship. And for the first time, when she felt the urge to ask for something, she just asked, without apologizing, without justifying, without softening the ground. She simply said, "I need some alone time today." And she waited. She waited for the rejection. She waited for the irritation. She waited for the confirmation that she was too difficult. But the person simply replied, "Sure, no problem." And Emily realized the catastrophe she'd been expecting her entire life. Every time she expressed a need had never been real. It was a projection. The complex was creating the expectation of rejection even before any actual response. You've just discovered the second most common cause of empty self-narcissism. One phrase, repeated every day. Installing an unconscious program that says your needs are defective. And here's the truth that few channels have the courage to say: this kind of deep psychological content is rare because it demands research, because it demands honesty about family dynamics that everyone prefers to pretend don't exist, because it requires connecting Carl Jung, who is dense and academic, with the real experiences of real people. In the last few minutes, you've seen how daily repetition bypasses the defenses of the inner child's ego, how mother's phrases become permanent identity, how the complex becomes automated and runs independently of the mother, how this transmits through generations, how this creates both empty self-narcissism and grandiose narcissism. The shadow self rears its head in these subtle, insidious ways. Each video like this costs hours of studying analytical psychology, clinical cases, connections that most psychologists don't make, because they work with more superficial models. The super thanks down below isn't just financial support. It's you saying that this truth about the formation of narcissism needs to be known. It's you helping to bring to light the family shadows that no one wants to see. When you click that heart, you're breaking the silence about wounds that have been normalized for generations. You're not just a spectator. You're someone who recognizes their own programming and wants awareness. Be part of those who are breaking cycles that have lasted 100 years. Now, what Emily did to uninstall the complex, the specific protocol that the Jungian therapist used, because knowing isn't enough. You need to repattern. First step, real-time recognition. Emily had to capture the complex the moment it fired, not hours later. In the exact second that the internal voice said, "You're so difficult," she had to pause and name it. That's the complex. It's not me. Jung knew that a complex only has power while it's unconscious. When you name it, when you see it, it loses 50% of its force immediately, because it can no longer disguise itself as your thought. Second step, tracing the origin. Every time the complex fired, Emily had to ask herself, when did I hear this for the first time? How did I feel? How old was I? And every time the memory came back, 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old, always the mom, always the same context. Emily expressing a basic human need, the mother responding with irritation, disguised as realism, a classic example of the negative mother archetype at play. Third step, questioning the truth. Emily had to ask the complex directly. Is it true that expressing needs makes me difficult? Is it true that needing help is a defect? Is it true that feeling hunger, tiredness, sadness, anger is too inconvenient to be valid? And when she formulated the questions this way, the obvious answer was no. Of course not. Human needs are human. They're not defects. But the complex doesn't work by logic. It works by recorded emotion. So Emily had to go deeper. Fourth step, emotional reparenting. The therapist asked Emily to write letters, not to her mom, to the 6-year-old child who heard "You're so difficult" for the first time. And in these letters, Emily had to say what the mother never said. Your needs are valid. You deserve to be seen. You are not a problem. You're a child needing care. And that's the most normal thing in the world. In the beginning, Emily wrote without feeling. They were just words. But the therapist insisted. Write every a day, even without believing it. The unconscious learns by repetition. Remember, if the toxic phrase entered by repetition, the healing phrase also enters by repetition. Emily wrote for 6 months, every day. Dear 6-year-old Emily, you're not difficult, you're just needing attention, and that's your right. And then something changed. She started to cry while writing, because finally, she was feeling the anger she never could feel at 6 years old, the sadness of never having been seen, the loneliness of growing up believing that her needs were a burden. It was like breaking through glass walls that had confined her inner child for decades. Jung used to say that a complex only dissolves when the repressed emotion is finally felt and integrated. While it's frozen, the complex remains active. When it thaws, when the person finally cries the pain they could never cry, the complex loses its fuel. It's like finally releasing the shadow self from its emotional prison. Emily cried for 3 months, cried for all the times she kept quiet, for all the requests for help she swallowed, for all the needs she killed, so as not to be difficult. A lifetime of emotional neglect finally surfacing. And after the crying passed, something new was born, a different voice, quiet at first, but firm, saying, "You can need, you can ask, you can exist fully, without apologizing." At 45 years old, Emily went back to visit her mother. Her mother was older, more fragile, and in the middle of lunch, she did what she always did. Criticized the food that Emily brought, said it was too salty, that she had warned her that she couldn't eat salt, that Emily never paid attention. A subtle form of gaslighting meant to undermine Emily's confidence. In the past, Emily would have apologized, would have shrunk, would have confirmed internally, "You're so difficult. You can't even make a simple meal right." But this time, Emily breathed, recognized the pattern, and said something simple. "Mom, I did the best I could. If it's not to your liking, you can season it as you prefer." The mother went silent, surprised, because Emily had never responded like that, without anger, without defense, just with clarity. And Emily realized she wasn't waiting for approval anymore. She wasn't trying to prove she wasn't difficult. She had accepted that for some people, including her mother, she would always be difficult. Not because she was, but because the mother's projection demanded it. Jung explained that true individuation happens when you stop trying to change your parents' perception of you. You liberate yourself from the negative mother archetype and begin to define yourself on your own terms. When you finally accept that they're going to die seeing you through the filter of their complexes, and that this doesn't define who you are, that's where the healing begins. Emily left that lunch at peace, not because her mom had changed, but because Emily had changed. The negative mother archetype still existed in her mother, but it no longer existed within Emily. That's the difference between knowledge and transformation. Thousands of people know, intellectually, that their mothers programmed them with toxic phrases, but they continue living as if those phrases are true, because knowing doesn't undo the programming. Only conscious and repeated emotional work can do that. Carl Jung insisted on this. The psyche doesn't change through insight alone. It changes through repeated corrective emotional experiences over time. Emily had to practice validating herself thousands of times until the new voice became stronger than the old voice, the voice of her inner child. And even today, at 50 years old, every now and then, the complex still flares up. You're so difficult. But now, Emily recognizes it instantly. She smiles and responds internally. That's the voice of my grandmother speaking through my mother. It has nothing to do with me. If you grew up hearing, "You're so difficult," or any variation of that, you carry a negative mother complex. It's operating now, controlling how you relate, how you ask for help, how you express your needs, how you judge yourself. And there are dozens of variations of that phrase. Each one installs the same basic program, but with different nuances. You're so sensitive. This creates hypersensitivity to judgment, like living behind glass walls. You're so dramatic. This teaches you that intense emotions are shameful. You're so demanding. This programs the child to never ask for anything. You're so needy. This transforms the need for connection into a moral defect, leading to feelings of emotional neglect and a desperate search for validation. Jung would explain that all these phrases do the same thing to the psychic structure. They tell the child there is something fundamentally wrong with who you are, not with what you do, but with who you are. And when the entire identity becomes the problem, there's no solution except to erase yourself, to hide in your shadow self. Emily's Jungian therapist worked with a group of women who carried variations of the same complex. One had heard, "You're never satisfied." Another, "You always cause problems." Another, "You're impossible to please." Different phrases, identical programming, all learned that expressing needs was a character flaw, and all developed the same symptoms in adulthood. Difficulty asking for help, relationships where they became invisible, self-sabotage when things started to go well, guilt when feeling anger, shame when feeling need, the constant sensation of being a burden to those they love, trapped in an echo chamber of self-doubt. Jung discovered that complexes with the same root can have 1,000 different manifestations, but the healing follows the same steps. And that was what gave Emily hope. If other women had managed to uninstall the program, she could too. One of the women in the group was 48 years old when she started therapy. She had spent her entire life in abusive relationships, because deep down, she believed she deserved it, because she was difficult, because she was too sensitive, because she was too needy. It took 2 years for her to understand that the voice saying these things wasn't hers. It was her mother's, repeated so many times that it had become an automatic thought. And when she finally managed to separate her mother's voice from her own voice, something broke. She cried for 3 weeks straight. And then, for the first time in 48 years, she left a toxic relationship, not because someone saved her, but because she finally recognized that her needs weren't a defect. They were human, and whoever couldn't respect them didn't deserve access to her. Another woman in the group had developed a different pattern. She had become the person who took care of everyone, who never asked for anything, who was always available, who sacrificed everything for others. But inside, she was dying of exhaustion and resentment, the constant gaslighting from within. Jung would call this the formation of a compulsive caregiver persona to compensate for the complex of being difficult. If I take care of everyone, I prove that I'm not difficult. If I never ask for anything, I prove that I'm not needy. If I sacrifice myself always, I prove that I'm not selfish. But the problem is that this persona wasn't her. It was a defense against the wound, and every defense, no matter how efficient, comes at a price. In her case, the price was burnout. At 42 years old, she couldn't get out of bed anymore. She couldn't take care of anyone anymore. Because she had completely exhausted herself, trying to prove that she wasn't difficult. The healing for her began when the therapist asked a simple question: what would happen if you stopped trying to prove that you're not difficult? She didn't know how to answer, because her entire identity was built around that proof. If she stopped proving it, who would she be? And that's the question that all people with a negative mother complex need to face. Who am I when I'm not trying to compensate for the wound? Who am I when I'm not proving that I deserve to exist? Who am I when I simply am? It took Emily 3 years to start answering that question, and the answer came slowly. She was someone who liked silence, who needed time alone to process emotions, who felt things deeply, who had clear boundaries about what she could and couldn't do. None of that was being difficult. It was being human, with specific needs, with specific sensitivities, with specific boundaries. And discovering this was like learning to breathe for the first time. But the complex didn't give up easily. Every time Emily set a boundary, the voice flared up. You're so difficult. Every time she said no, the voice criticized. You're so selfish. Every time she asked for something, the voice shamed her. You're so needy. And Emily had to repeat the protocol, recognize the complex, trace the origin, question the truth, reparent herself, feel the repressed emotion, repeat the new truth, 5 times a day, 10 times a day, 20 times a day, until one day, the new voice became stronger than the old voice. Until one day, when she set a boundary, the first voice that came was, "You have the right to protect your energy." That took 4 years. 4 years of conscious daily work, but it was worth every second, because for the first time in her life, Emily wasn't at war with herself anymore. She wasn't trying to kill parts of herself to be acceptable. She simply was. And that was enough. And the only way to break it is to do what Emily did. Recognize it in real time. Trace the origin. Question the truth. Emotionally reparent yourself. Feel the frozen pain, and repeat the new truth until it replaces the old lie. It's not going to be quick, it's not going to be easy, but it will be liberating, because you weren't born difficult. You were born human, with legitimate needs, and someone taught you that those needs were a defect. But they weren't. They never were. Now, tell me something. What phrase did your mom repeat every day that you still hear in your head as if it were your own voice? Don't hold back. Write it down below, because naming the phrase is already the first step toward uninstalling the complex. When you put it into words, when you externalize it, you strip its power to operate in the shadows, the shadow self. As Carl Jung would say, how many here recognize their own mother in this pattern? How many of you still judge yourselves as difficult because every time you need something? Write it down there, because you are not alone. And recognizing that, in community, is part of the healing. A crucial step toward reclaiming your inner child. Think of it as disarming the negative mother archetype that Carl Jung so astutely identified.